Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I'm back again today doing another video, and the subject of today's video is going to be on NBA players, specifically players that I find to be overrated in the NBA. So recently I did a video concentrating on players that I thought were underrated. Today I am going to be talking about players that I think are overrated, as in people perceive them to be better than they are. Now I'd like to put out a disclaimer here. I'm going to be mainly targeting players that are actually pretty talented and are pretty good players. But what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying that some people have them as, let's say, a top 5, top 10 player. And I think they're more in the top 25 range where they just aren't quite as good as people are saying they are. And you'll see some of the type of players that I'm going to be referencing as we get into this. But I'm going to be looking at a variety of things like um, statistics, team success. Those are the main two I'm going to be focusing on. Also, just things like their situation too, like how much talent is surrounding them on their team, and things like that as far as how I'm going to be perceiving them. So first off, I'm going to start off with one that I think may be a more common take, and that's going to be Devin Booker. So yes, I do think Devin Booker is an overrated player. Phoenix has been a pretty awful team the last couple of years. They're regularly at the bottom of the NBA and a pretty high lottery team. And Devin Booker has been the main option on this team. Really, he had a 22-point season where he averaged 22 points per game. And then I think 2017 to 18 he averaged around 25. And then this last year he averaged a tick below 27 points per game, and he had 7 assists as well. Now, while these are impressive numbers, his shooting percentages have never been uh, great. They're always around like 44%, which is fine for a shooting guard who is a volume shooter. But up until this season, where the Suns basically forced him to play point guard because they didn't have an actual point guard on the roster, he didn't do anything else. Like this season, he did assist more, he did pass a bit more and ball handle a bit more, so that naturally led to an increase in assists. But when he was just playing shooting guard, he was getting like 4 assists per game, which isn't that much. So essentially, what I'm getting at here is when he's not forced to handle the ball basically every possession, his assists are relatively low, and he's honestly, from what I've seen, he's mainly just a scorer and doesn't do much else on his team. Not really a defender of note whatsoever, like an average to below average defender. Honestly, at this point, a little bit below average, but if he just put in some effort, he could be average. And of course, the big thing for me for Devin Booker is the team success. You know, if the Suns were a 50-win team and he was putting up the 27 points per game, I would not find nearly as much fault or criticism of him being overrated. But because they're like always seemingly recently between an 18 win to 25 win team, I don't think his numbers are impressive. He really seems to be falling into the category of a good stats bad team type of player. And I'd be really interested to see if he went to a better team or if the Suns got an influx of talent and were like a 55 win team, if he would be the main option or if he would be lower. To me, he doesn't yet have the talent to be like a number one option on a really good contending team. Like, I'm trying to think of an example here. Let's say that he were to go to the Utah Jazz right now and he were to play small forward instead of Bojan Bogdanovic, just for a hypothetical. And you have guys on the court like him, Donovan Mitchell, Mike Conley. I don't know that Devin Booker would be the number one option. There are nights where I think he could be the number 3 option based on that team, or a number of different things like that. But I'm just not sold on him because he's had seasons where I think 2 years ago when he averaged 22 points per game, he was taking around 20 shots per night, which is, if you know about NBA efficiency and getting to the free throw line and stuff, scoring like 22 points on 20 shots a night is not great. And I think a lot of his statistical success has come from just being given a ton of shots every night rather than actually being really good. And I think that is reflected in his free throw, or excuse me, field goal percentage. Excuse me. Next on here, I have a guy that is similar, I think, and that is CJ McCollum. CJ McCollum, I think, is is not overrated in the sense that it's not like he's like a five-time All-Star or something. He has actually never been an All-Star, which is I think the aspect of his career that is properly rated because I don't think he's ever been deserving of an All-Star selection. He's very similar to Devin Booker in that he scores like somewhere between 20 to 23 points over the past couple of seasons, but he takes a ton of shots to do it as well. He's had seasons where he's taking basically about 20 shots to score 21 points a night. His rate of getting to the free throw line is relatively poor. I think his highest season from when I was looking at his numbers was he was getting to the free throw line and taking like 3 free throw attempts a game, which is very low for a dude that really all he brings to the table is scoring. He doesn't really assist, maybe like 4 to 5 on his better nights. He doesn't really rebound because he's only like 6'3", 6'2", so he gets like 2 to 3 rebounds a night. So really, all he can give you is scoring, and he's not a chucker because I feel like that's a little unfair, but he does take a ton of shots, and um, you know, his field goal percentage is always hovering around like 42%. 2018 season he did have a pretty high one. It was like 48, but the other seasons he's like uniformly at 42%. So I think that 48% was more the exception to the rule rather than the rule. So I guess the point I'm trying to get across here is I don't think Dame Lillard's the second option on a championship contender, like people want to think he is. Sort of, I think people want to believe that this Trailblazers team is like a championship contender, and I really don't think it is. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the video, actually, but um, I just don't see him as a second option on a championship team. I see him more as like the fourth option. So what I mean by that is if you look at a team like um, Philadelphia, they had basically Tobias Harris as their fourth option last year. I think that's where like a CJ McCollum fits in, is that he can't be the 1, 2, or 3 maybe the 3 option on a championship level team if the 1 and the 2 is like AD and LeBron, or like Kawhi and Paul George, excuse me. But I think what I'm trying to get at here is I think people want to lump CJ McCollum into sort of like a bracket with like DeMar DeRozan and even possibly like Jimmy Butler, Bradley Beal, that sort of thing. I don't think he's that good as those guys that I just listed. I think he's closer to Lou Williams. I'd say he's basically like young Lou Williams getting more of a shot. That's how I feel. Or Jason Terry, depending on what age bracket you watch basketball in. So Jason Terry's obviously out of the league now, but he plays a lot more like Jason Terry and Lou Williams than he does like Bradley Beal or those other guys I was listing. I don't think he's quite at an all-star caliber player. I think he's just kind of like a really good six man on a really good team. I think he'd be a six man is what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so next I'm going to roll into the other part of the Trailblazers that I want to talk about, which is Damian Lillard. Yes, Damian Lillard. I don't mean to shock you. I don't mean to upset you if you're a huge Damian Lillard fan. I, of course, am impressed by Damian Lillard. The shot against the Thunder where he was essentially at half court, dribbling back and forth and did a step back. At nearly half court, he did a step back, and he made that shot. That was very impressive. I commend him. I think it was one of the biggest upsets, not biggest upsets of all time, but I think it was a very, very impressive showing that they got to the Western Conference Finals over the Nuggets. I think the Nuggets were supremely more talented, but I think the thing that the Trailblazers have is they have been in the playoffs a lot. They have been there almost every year. But if you look at Damian Lillard's career, the times where he's sort of like been the man on his team, let's review. 2013, the Blazers didn't make the playoffs, as I recall, when he was a rookie. 2014, they got to the second round and got swept by the Spurs. 2015, they lost in the first round. 2016, they lost in the second round, but remember, they only got to the second round because both Chris Paul and Blake Griffin got injured against them in the first round early on, and they basically had a bye to the second round, wherein they lost to the Warriors in 5 games. And you might say, well, they at least got a game on the Warriors. But Steph was out for like half that series, and so they took advantage when Steph was out and got 1 game on them. 2017, they when Dame is like hitting his prime, like 26 points per game, good efficiencies, like 45% from the field and like 30, 36, 37, 38% from three. During that time where Dame is like statistically at his prime, the Blazers were like 41 and 41. And you might say, "Well, what are you talking about? Like they never had any help for him or whatever." They essentially had the same core from 2015 to 2019. I know a few pieces have moved around, like they traded the Plumlee brother for Nurkic, and they just got Rodney Hood and Seth Curry this last year and stuff like that. But essentially, the core of this team for those 4 years was Dame, CJ, Mo Harkless, and Al-Farouq Aminu. And so I don't get how we commend them this last year when they win 53 games and they got to the Western Conference Finals. But then nobody ever talks about, well, basically that same core was only a 41 win team and got swept by the Warriors in 2017. 2018, they were the 3 seed and they had 49 wins and they got swept by the 6 seeded Pelicans, who, again, let me remind you, did not have arguably their best player in DeMarcus Cousins, who before his injury was averaging 26 and 13 on great efficiency. So they were essentially getting swept by a team who were led by Anthony Davis, obviously a great player, Drew Holiday, and Rajon Rondo. And not that those guys aren't talented, but the Blazers should have won that series, and I think it really exposed that yes, Dame's good, but his game doesn't necessarily translate to success. And what I mean by that is I think that he's a good regular season player in that um, on a night to night basis, people are not going to be like trying their very very hardest, and I think Dame is a dude that tries really really hard in every game he plays. And I think because of that, they get a lot more wins than they would if every game was being treated like a playoff game. So like guys, major stars in the NBA like Kawhi, LeBron, even Anthony Davis sometimes, other players, they sort of have their nights where they play hard and they really go for it, and then they sort of have nights during the regular season where they take the night off, so to speak, and maybe LeBron would have a night where he scores like 30, 10, and 10. That's like a night where he'd be on, so to speak, but a night where he's off, he'd be averaging more like, or he would get more totals like 18, 7, and 7. And that's a night where he's sort of taking it off, so to speak. But Damian Lillard never does that. And I think because of that, because he's always good for the 28 points a night, the Blazers get a lot of games during the regular season where they wouldn't if everyone was trying their hardest every game. He's also a relatively healthy player, so that helps the Blazers get more wins too. But I think that they are the Bengals of the NBA. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, the Cincinnati Bengals had a stretch where from probably about 2008, I'd say, to around 2016, 17, they made the playoffs like 7 times, and they lost in the first round every time. They're also a lot like the Houston Texans, who, if you don't know much about them, I think like since 2010 they made the playoffs like 5 times, and every time they've lost in the first round. Or if they did get to the second round, it was because of like a huge upset, or like Derek Carr got injured one year and the Texans made it to the second round because their starting quarterback was out for the Raiders. So they feel a lot like that. They feel like the team that never really they never make any noise in the playoffs, and if they do, and like this last year when they got to the Western Conference Finals, immediately when they beat the Nuggets, my first thought was, okay, Golden State's going to sweep them, and they did right away. So that's where I think Dame's overrated, is that he's never really had that much success, but because he has really gaudy numbers, people think he's great. I think he's a really good player. I just don't know if he's necessarily like, I've heard some people say he's as high as like top 5 and he's like on the level of Curry. I don't know about that. I don't think so. So there's my take on Dame Lillard. A guy that plays similar to Dame Lillard that I'm going to bring up now is Kyrie Irving. I'm going to touch a few of the same points and spend a little bit less time on him. I think that Kyrie is definitely a very good player. I think he's all-star caliber, of course. I think he's like maybe third team all NBA worthy some years, but I don't know. I hear people that reference him in the conversation for like best point guard in the game, like again on the level of like a Steph Curry. I don't think he's anywhere near there. I think on some of his best nights, maybe he's like the fourth best point guard in the NBA. I still like Steph and I still like Dame ahead of him, and I still like Westbrook ahead of him, honestly, even though some people would disagree with me. I have never seen, besides the years where LeBron was on the Cavs, Kyrie has never done anything of note in the NBA. And that may seem like a really harsh statement, but let's look at 2011 to 14 on the Cavs. They're like a 20 win team, a 28 win team, and then like a 30 win team. Never really did anything. And here's the thing though, in 2013 to 14, before LeBron got there, when they just had a core of like Kyrie, Anderson Varejao, Dion Waiters, and Andrew Bynum actually for a little while, if you forgot that. I thought that they'd be a playoff team that year. I thought that they'd sneak in and be the 8 seed. And they were like a 30 win team, and they really disappointed me because I expected a lot more off Kyrie. And at that point, I sort of said to myself, like, okay, this guy cannot be a number one on a championship level team. LeBron comes, they're a title contending team for the 3 years that Kyrie's there. They do win the title when he did make one of the biggest shots in NBA history. I give him props for that. That was an awesome shot. I was cheering wildly when he made that shot. Um, but when he leaves the Cavs, he goes to the Celtics. Last year, he didn't really prove anything because he was injured during um, the time when the money's on the table and the cards were down in the playoffs. He wasn't there, so he didn't really prove that he was a leader in that series or that he could be a leader on a contender. And then this last year, they did get to the second round of the playoffs with him as the leader and him as like the main option, so to speak. But they got a gentleman's sweep. The Bucks did a gentleman's sweep on them, 5 games, and they only won the first round, maybe because Victor Oladipo, the best player on the Pacers, was out. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case. Maybe they would have still beaten them, but Kyrie as the guy, like the main option on a team, has never really proven anything for me to say like, oh, he is like the man. He's only ever done anything of note as the second option on a team, not the first option. And so for that, I gotta dispel anybody saying, oh, he's a top 10 player in the league, which I hear a lot of people say. Kyrie's top 10. Kyrie's top 10. To me, he's top 20, but he's not top 10. He's for sure like not even a top 3 point guard in the league. And here's a fun note. This last season, 2018 and 19, he did make the All NBA second team, which I think was relatively deserved. But before that, in the remaining 7 years of his career, where he's been like a 4-time All Star, he only ever made one other All NBA team, which was the All NBA third team in like 2014 or 15, I think. Uh, yeah, so I think that's just something interesting is that like amongst people voting on the All NBA teams in the league, he's only ever made it one other time besides this past year. So that's just a little thing I want to throw in there. And now Jimmy Butler, who is my last player. I have watched a lot of Jimmy Butler. I am, of course, a Timberwolves guy, so I watched him when he was in Minnesota. Very good when he was in Minnesota. And I think if not for his injury in that season, the Wolves would have been the 3 seed, which they were before he went down injured for like 25 games. I want to point that out. So I think if he would have stayed healthy that season, they would have been the 3 seed. I think they would have got to the second round, and I think they would have got clobbered by the Warriors in the second round. But to my main point, I think I also hear people reference Jimmy Butler as like a top 10 player as well, like Kyrie. I've heard Tom Thibodeau said that Jimmy Butler was like one of the 8 best players in the NBA. And in that moment, I wanted to jump into my TV screen and say, Tom, what about LeBron, Durant, Giannis, Steph, Harden, Embiid, Anthony Davis, Kawhi, and the list goes on. But I don't think he's a top 10 player. I think he's top 20, top 25 in there. Well, realistically, probably top 20. But I think he's a dude that gets really overrated. Like there aren't okay. Just to be clear here, he is a very good player. He's a very good defender. And people look to him as a guy who can be like your number one option on a really good team. But when Jimmy Butler has been a number one guy on his teams have not gone far. So I'd say in Philadelphia this last year, he was not the number one guy. You essentially say he was the number 2 most nights. But there was a lot of nights where Jimmy Butler was the 4th guy. And I'm not exaggerating. There were games where he'd score 13 or 12, but then you'd have like Simmons with 16, Harris with 20, and Embiid with 25 sort of thing. So he didn't have as much pressure to be like the guy in Philly. And to an extent, same in Minnesota. Like if you look at his stats from Minnesota, it was like Cat averaging 22, Wiggins averaging 18, and like Butler averaging 18. And of course, in a lot of the important games, he was like the number one guy. But overall, he was really like basically the two on that team. And they did get to the playoffs, and they were like a 47 win team. But I just want to make it clear that basically Butler was the number two on the Timberwolves. In Chicago in 2017, yes, he was the number one guy. But I will also like to remind you that was a 41 win team. Not that good. Also, Dwayne Wade was still playing at a pretty respectable level, averaging like 18 a game. And they didn't have an awful team. They had Bobby Portis, they had Nikola Mirotic, they had some decent players, Taj Gibson for about half the season, but they were only a 41 win team. But yet people look at that season as like the Jimmy Butler breakout, where he really showed us like I'm a top 10 player, and I never saw that. I always saw a dude who was averaging 20 points per game, was a good defender, but really on a championship team was arguably the third scoring. Should be on a championship team, I think Jimmy Butler should be the third scoring option, maybe the two if there's a lot of really good role players. Okay, 2015 to 16. Jimmy Butler's arguably the top players on the Bulls that year. They still have Pau Gasol and Derrick Rose, but they each took a little bit of a step back. Pau Gasol was still an All-Star actually, but Jimmy Butler was arguably the top player. And what did they do that season? They went, I believe, 42 and 40. So in Jimmy Butler's main two seasons as like the star of the show in Chicago, they collectively went like 83 and 81. So it's not like he was ever lighting up the world and leading them to the or Eastern Conference Finals or anything. So let's see here. The season before that, 2015, you had Derrick Rose and Pau Gasol and Jimmy Butler, and there wasn't really like a main guy. Kind of all three had about the same level of. There just wasn't really like a pecking order. They were all kind of all three on the same level, I'd say, all about getting 18 to 20 points per game. They did make the second round that year, but again, I think they lost in six to the Cavs. Good team, but not that great. 2014 lost in the first round where Jimmy was averaging like 13 points a game. 2013, again, he averaged like 9 points per game and they lost in the second round, but he wasn't really contributing. And then 2012, they lost in the first round and Jimmy was playing like 2 minutes a night. But if you look at the scope of his career, 8 seasons, he's lost in the first round in 5 of them, lost in the second round in 3 of them. But 2 of the times he got to the second round, or excuse me, one of the times was 2013, which doesn't really count because he's playing like 15 minutes a night and was averaging like 7 points per game. 2019, I still maintain that Philly should have won that series versus the Raptors. I think they had an even shot, and I think that actually was like the two best teams in the NBA. But you know, like the Warriors would have been better with everyone healthy, but I think Philly with that team, they were the second best team in the playoffs. Okay, but whatever. And then 2015, they got to the second round, but Jimmy wasn't like the undisputed number one. But what I want to point out basically is when Jimmy Butler's been the undisputed number one on a team, which is essentially 2 seasons, 2016 to 2018, his team collectively went 83 and 81. That's not impressive. Jimmy Butler, get to the conference finals before you start talking so much smack to the Timberwolves players about being a top 10 player. Because Jimmy Butler was complaining and saying, like, I'm one of the best players out here, yada, yada, yada. And basically when I kept hearing that, I kept saying, like, what have you done? What have you done? Nothing. He's been a first round exit basically when he's been the dude. So I can't give him that much clout for that. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below. I know you might disagree heavily with me. Let me know. I bring it on. I will defend my takes. So there you have it. Hope you guys have a good day. See you next time. Bye.